The transport truck rattled over the uneven road, its canvas cover flapping in the late summer wind of 1945. Inside, 17 women sat in silence, their bodies swaying with each pothole, their eyes fixed on nothing in particular. They had stopped speaking hours ago. What was left to say? The war was over. Germany had fallen, and they, members of the Nachrichtenhelferinnen, the Women's Auxiliary Communications Corps, were now prisoners in a country whose language they barely understood and whose customs felt as distant as the moon. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So, if you are enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Greta Hoffmann pressed her palm against the rough wooden bench beneath her, feeling the splinters catch at her skin. She was 24 years old, though she felt decades older. Her blonde hair, which had been kept in neat regulation braids, now hung limp and unwashed around her face. Beside her sat Liesel Krause, 19, round-faced and freckled, who had joined the Corps thinking it would keep her away from the front lines. It had, technically, but it hadn't kept her from this. "Do you think they'll separate us?" Liesel whispered, her voice barely audible over the engine's growl. Greta didn't answer immediately. She watched Margaret Fischer across from them, 32, a former schoolteacher from Munich who had lost her husband at Stalingrad and her 2 sons somewhere in the ruins of Berlin. Marguerite's hands were folded in her lap, trembling slightly, though her face remained composed. Behind her sat Anneliese Weber, a farm girl from Bavaria with work-roughened hands and a directness that had made her both respected and feared among the other women. Anneliese had stopped crying 3 days ago. Now she just stared. "I don't know," Greta finally said. "I don't know anything anymore." The truck lurched to a stop. The women tensed collectively, a single organism preparing for the unknown. They heard American voices outside, young, casual, punctuated by laughter that seemed obscene in its lightness. How could anyone laugh? How could the world contain laughter when everything had ended? The canvas flat pulled back, and sunlight flooded in, momentarily blinding them. An American soldier stood there, barely older than Liesel, with red hair and a face full of freckles that made him look like a schoolboy playing dress-up in his father's uniform. He didn't look cruel. He looked uncomfortable. "All right, ladies," he said in careful, accented German, "welcome to Camp Stark. You'll be processed here. Medical checks, documentation, assignment to barracks. Follow the rules and you'll be treated fairly. Cause trouble and, well, don't cause trouble." He stepped back, and one by one, the women climbed down from the truck. Greta's legs nearly gave out when her feet hit solid ground. 3 weeks of transport, first by train, then by ship across an Atlantic that seemed determined to swallow them whole, then by truck through an American countryside so vast and untouched by war that it felt like a mockery. She had seen farmland that stretched to the horizon, painted barns, cattle grazing peacefully. Not a single bombed-out building, not a one crater, not one burned field. Camp Stark was a sprawling complex of wooden barracks surrounded by chain-link fencing, topped with barbed wire. Guard towers stood at each corner, though the soldiers manning them looked bored rather than vigilant. Beyond the fence, Greta could see a small American town. White houses with porches, a church steeple, a main street with storefronts. Normal life, continuing as if the world hadn't just torn itself apart. The processing took hours. They stood in lines, answered questions through translators, submitted to medical examinations that felt invasive and humiliating. Greta watched a nurse examine Liesel's teeth like she was livestock being appraised. The girl's face burned red, but she said nothing. What could she say? They had no power here, no voice, no identity beyond prisoner and enemy. By the time they were led to their assigned barracks, evening was falling. The building was long and plain, with rows of narrow beds covered in thin mattresses and scratchy wool blankets. It smelled of pine lumber and disinfectant. 50 women would share this space, they were told. 50 women who spoke the same language but came from different cities, different backgrounds, different lives that war had compressed into this single, shared reality. Greta claimed a bed near the window. Not because the view was particularly appealing, but because the alternative was claiming a bed in the center of the room, surrounded on all sides by strangers and their nightmares. She sat on the edge of the mattress, testing its give. It was better than the ship's hold, better than the cattle cars, better than the rubble she'd slept on during the final weeks in Berlin. But better was a relative term that meant nothing anymore. "They say we'll get dinner soon," Liesel said, sitting on the bed next to Greta's. The girl was trying to sound hopeful. Greta appreciated the effort even as she felt nothing in response to it. Margaret settled onto a bed across the aisle. "Dinner," she repeated, as if tasting the word. "I wonder what American prison food tastes like." "Can't be worse than sawdust bread," Annalisa said from 2 beds down. "Can't be worse than nothing." The dinner bell rang at 6 o'clock, a loud clanging that made several women jump. They filed out of the barracks in an uncertain mass, following the other groups of prisoners towards a large building that served as the mess hall. Inside, the room was bright with electric lights, so much light after months of darkness, and filled with long tables and benches. The smell of cooking food made my stomach clench with a hunger I'd been trying to ignore. They lined up, were handed metal trays and utensils, and shuffled past a serving line where American soldiers spooned food onto their plates. Greta stared at what she was being given. Mashed potatoes, some kind of meat and gravy, green beans, a thick slice of white bread, and a small square of butter. Real butter. Not the ersatz oil they'd been choking down for years. Real, yellow butter. But it was what came next that stopped her in her tracks. The soldier at the end of the line, a heavy-set man with kind eyes and graying temples, held up 2 bottles. One was dark brown, the other lighter with a red label. He gestured between them, speaking in English she didn't understand, then tried in halting German, "Choose. Drink. Good." Greta looked at the bottles, then at the soldier's expecting face. Behind her, the line was backing up. Liesel leaned around her, curious. "What are those?" "I don't know," Greta admitted. She pointed at the darker bottle, more out of confusion than preference. The soldier grinned, actually grinned, and used a metal opener to pop the cap off with a practiced flick. Foam bubbled up from the bottle's mouth, and he quickly handed it to her before it could overflow. "Rootbier," he said, pronouncing the words carefully. "American tradition. You'll like." Greta took the bottle, feeling its coolness against her palm, and moved along. She found a seat at one of the long tables, Liesel sliding in beside her, Marguerite and Annalise joining them moments later. They all had bottles now. Liesel and Annalise had chosen the same dark brown beverage as Greta, while Marguerite held the lighter bottle with a red label. For a long moment, none of them moved. They just stared at the food in front of them, at these bottles of unknown liquid, at this strange new reality where their captor served them butter and offered them choices. "It's still warm," Liesel whispered, touching the potatoes with her fork. "The food is actually warm." Marguerite lifted her bottle and examined the label. "Coca-Cola," she read aloud. "I've heard of this. Before the war, some of the Americans living in Munich had it. They said it was like medicine, almost. Sweet medicine." "Medicine?" Annalise snorted. "Let's hope it's not poison." But despite her words, she raised her bottle of root beer to her lips and took a small, cautious sip. Her eyes widened. She lowered the bottle slowly, staring at it as if it had just performed a magic trick. "Mein Gott, what is this?" she breathed. Greta brought her own bottle to her lips. The smell was strange, sweet but with something else underneath, something almost medicinal like Marguerite had said, but not quite. She tipped the bottle and let a small amount of liquid enter her mouth. The taste exploded across her tongue. Sweet, yes, but also something she'd never experienced before. It was like vanilla, but not vanilla. Like herbs, but not any herbs she knew. It was cold and fizzy, the carbonation sharp and almost painful, and sweet in a way that made her teeth ache. It was completely unlike anything she had ever tasted, utterly foreign, and yet somehow not terrible. She swallowed and looked at Liesel, who was now trying her own bottle. The girl's face went through a rapid series of expressions: surprise, confusion,
consideration, and finally, something that might have been the ghost of pleasure. It's so sweet. How can anything be this sweet? Marguerite had opened her Coca-Cola and taken a drink. Her reaction was similar: wide eyes, a moment of processing, a slow nod. "This is different," she said. "Sharper, less round than yours." She gestured at their root beer bottles. Around them, the mess hall filled with similar reactions. Some women recoiled from their first taste, setting the bottles down with looks of disgust. Others, like a thin woman Greta recognized from the transport ship, drank deeply, desperately, as if trying to fill some void that food alone couldn't reach. The American soldiers watched with expressions ranging from amusement to sympathy, occasionally offering encouraging words in English that nobody understood. Greta took another sip of the root beer, letting it sit in her mouth longer this time, trying to identify the flavors. It was sweet, yes, overwhelmingly so, but there was something else, a bite, a complexity. It made her think of the root cellars back home, of sassafras and wintergreen, though she couldn't be sure if those were actually the flavors or just her mind trying to make sense of the foreign by connecting it to the familiar. "Do you think this is what they drink every day? Just whenever they want?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Because if this was casual, if this sweetness and abundance was ordinary, then what kind of country were they in? What kind of people had defeated them?
Greta looked down at her tray, at the real meat, the real butter, the vegetables that were actually green. She thought of the ration cards, the turnip winters, the bread that was more sawdust than grain, the ersatz coffee made from roasted acorns. She thought of her mother in Hamburg, if her mother was even still alive, and the last letter she'd received 9 months ago that spoke of eating wallpaper paste and boiling leather shoe soles for soup. And here, in this prison camp, on her first night as a captive, she had been given butter and a bottle of sweetness and a choice between 2 different beverages, as if her preference mattered. She didn't know whether to laugh or cry. She did neither. Instead, she took another sip of the root beer and forced herself to eat the potatoes, even though her stomach had shrunk so much over the past months that it cramped after just a few bites. Annalise finished her bottle first, tilting it back to get the last drops. She set it down with a hollow thunk on the wooden table. "My youngest sister would have loved this," she said suddenly, her voice flat. "Heidi, she was 12 when—" She stopped, swallowed. "She would have thought this was magic." Margarita reached across the table and placed her hand over Annalise's work-roughened one. They sat like that for a moment, 2 women who had lost everything, connected by the simple weight of a hand and the complicated taste of root beer. Liesel wasn't eating much. She kept picking at her food, rearranging it on her plate. "I can't stop thinking," she said quietly, "about what we did, about what we were part of." "We were communications operators," Greta said quickly. "We sent messages. We sent messages that helped the war continue," Liesel interrupted, her voice shaking. "Every message we sent, every order we transmitted, it was all part of all of it. And now we're here, drinking this sweet American soda, and people at home are starving, and we—" She put down her fork. "How can we just sit here and eat?" It was the question they'd all been avoiding, the guilt that sat heavier than hunger, more bitter than any ersatz coffee. They had survived. They had been captured, yes, but they had survived. And now they were being fed and given shelter and offered something as frivolous as flavored, fizzy drinks, while back home, Greta forced those thoughts away. She had to. If she let herself think about Hamburg, about her family, about the friends who hadn't made it to this strange American camp with its electric lights and its impossible abundance, she would shatter into pieces too small to ever reassemble. "We eat," Margarita said firmly, "because the alternative is dying, and I don't think Heidi or my sons or anyone we've lost would want us to die out of guilt. We eat and we survive, and maybe
Maybe that's the only way we can ever make any of this mean something." They finished their meal in near silence, the mess hall around them gradually filling with similar pockets of quiet conversation. The bottles emptied, some quickly, some reluctantly, some savored sip by sip, as if the sweetness was something to be hoarded against future bitterness. When the dinner bell rang again, signaling the end of the meal period, they filed back to their barracks. The evening air was cooling, and Greta could hear crickets chirping, such a normal, peaceful sound. Above them, the sky was deepening to twilight blue, and she could see the first stars beginning to appear. The same stars that shone over Hamburg, over Berlin, over all the places that no longer existed as she remembered them. In the barracks, women prepared for sleep, though few would actually achieve it. Greta lay on her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, and found herself thinking not about the war, not about her family, not about the uncertain future, but about that bottle of root beer, about how strange it was that her first taste of America would be something so sweet, so unexpected, so utterly civilian in a world that had been defined by violence and deprivation. She thought about the soldier who had served it, the one with kind eyes and graying temples, and how he had smiled when he opened the bottle, as if this small act of giving a prisoner a drink was genuinely important to him, as if she, Greta Hoffmann, former communications operator for a defeated army, was still human enough to deserve a choice between two beverages, as if her preference mattered in a world that had spent 6 years demonstrating that nothing about her, her life, her choices, her humanity, had mattered at all. Somewhere in the darkness of the barracks, someone was crying, quiet, muffled sobs that the woman tried to bury in her pillow. No one offered comfort. They were all too full of their own grief, too exhausted by their own survival. Greta closed her eyes and tried to remember the taste of the root beer, that strange, sweet, complex flavor that was nothing like anything she'd ever known. She held on to it like a talisman, this tiny thing, this moment of unexpected gentleness in the midst of devastation. Outside, the American guards changed shifts. Inside, 17 women who had lost their country, their war, and their identities tried to sleep in a prison camp that offered them butter and choices and the first tastes of a world they would have to learn to navigate. The root beer bottle sat empty on the floor beside Greta's bed. In the morning, it would be collected, washed, and used again. But tonight, it remained, a small brown glass monument to the moment when everything that was familiar ended and something entirely new, entirely foreign, and entirely uncertain began. Morning arrived too early, announced by a bell that sounded exactly like the one the evening before, loud, metallic, indifferent to the fact that most of the women had only just managed to fall asleep an hour earlier. Greta awoke with a start, momentarily disoriented. For a fraction of a second, she thought she was back in the communications bunker in Berlin, and the bell was an air raid warning. Then reality reasserted itself. The wooden barracks, the rows of narrow beds, and the pale faces of women who had spent the night wrestling with their own thoughts.
"Formation in 15 minutes," an American voice called from outside. "Breakfast follows. Move quickly, ladies." Greta sat up, her body protesting. The thin mattress had done little to cushion her from the wooden slats beneath, and her back ached. Around her, women were rising with varying degrees of reluctance. Liesel, in the next bed, looked like she hadn't slept at all. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her hands trembled as she tried to lace her boots. "Did you sleep?" Greta asked, though she already knew the answer. Liesel shook her head. "Every time I closed my eyes, I kept seeing everything. The last days in Berlin, the Russians, the flight west." She paused, swallowing hard. "And then I'd remember where we are, and it felt like drowning." Marguerite was already dressed, her clothes as neat as they could be given their condition. She had been a teacher, Greta remembered, someone who had spent her life maintaining order and routine for children.
Perhaps that training was what allowed her to function now, to impose structure on chaos. "We need to establish routines," Marguerite said, addressing the small group that had formed around her. "Routines will help. They'll give us something to hold on to." Annalise was braiding her hair with quick, practiced movements, the movements of someone who had been doing farm work since childhood, who knew the value of keeping hair out of the way. "Routines," she muttered, "as if this is normal, as if we're just going about our daily lives." "We're not," Marguerite agreed, "but we're alive, and we have to act like it." They formed up outside the barracks, lining up in rows as instructed. The morning sun was already warm. It was late August, and even this far north in America, the summer heat lingered. An American officer walked along the rows, clipboard in hand, counting. He looked young, maybe 30, with sandy hair and a face that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. When he reached Greta's row, he paused. "You speak English?" he asked, looking directly at her. Greta hesitated, then nodded. "A little. I studied in school." His expression brightened slightly. "Good. We need translators. See Sergeant Morrison after breakfast." He moved on before she could respond. Liesel leaned close. "What did he say?" "They want me to translate," Greta said, still processing. The idea of being useful, of having a role beyond prisoner, felt strange, almost dangerous. What if she became too comfortable? What if she started to forget? Breakfast was in the same mess hall as dinner had been, but the morning light made everything look different, harsher, more real. The food was different too, something called oatmeal, thick and pale in their bowls, with brown sugar and milk offered as additions. There were also eggs, powdered, reconstituted, but eggs nonetheless, and toast with jam. And again, at the end of the line, those bottles. This time Greta chose the Coca-Cola, curious about the difference. The soldier serving, a different one from the night before, younger and more nervous, opened it for her with the same practiced motion. The liquid inside was darker than the root beer, almost black, and when she sipped it, the taste was sharper, more acidic with a different kind of sweetness. It bit at her tongue in a way that was both unpleasant and oddly compelling. "Thoughts?" Marguerite asked, having chosen the same. Greta took another sip, considering. "It's angrier than the root beer, more aggressive." Aggressive soda, only in America. But she was drinking it too, and despite her words, she didn't seem to hate it. The oatmeal was strange, too sweet with the brown sugar, bland without it. Greta found herself mixing in some of the powdered eggs, creating a combination that probably would have horrified the American cooks, but that tasted to her more substantial. Around them, conversations were starting to develop. The initial shock of captivity was wearing off slightly, and women were beginning to talk to each other, to form connections. 2 beds down from Greta's was a woman named Hilda Schaefer, who had been a telegraph operator in Hamburg. She was thin to the point of emaciation, her collarbones prominent beneath her worn dress. She had barely touched her dinner the night before, and now she pushed her oatmeal around her bowl without eating. "You need to eat," Greta found herself saying, sliding onto the bench next to Hilda. "I know it's hard, but you need to." Hilda looked at her with haunted eyes. "What's the point?" she asked quietly. "We're prisoners. We'll be here for years probably. Germany is gone. My family is probably dead. What's the point of eating and surviving just to sit at a camp and remember everything we've lost?"
It was the same question Liesel had asked the night before, phrased differently but carrying the same weight. Greta wanted to have an answer, something profound or comforting, but she didn't. She only had the truth, which was inadequate but real. "I don't know if there's a point," Greta admitted. But I know that if we give up now, if we stop eating and just fade away, then we're letting the war take more from us than it already has, and I'm not ready to give it that victory. Hilda stared at her for a long moment, then picked up her spoon. She took one bite of oatmeal, then another. It wasn't much, but it was something. After breakfast, Greta reported to Sergeant Morrison as instructed. She found him in a small office in one of the administrative buildings, a cramped space with a desk, filing cabinets, and a map of Europe on the wall. The map still showed the old borders, the ones that no longer existed. Germany was marked in its full pre-war extent, as if the past 6 years had been a dream. Morrison was the man with kind eyes who had served her drinks the night before. Up close, Greta could see he was older than she'd initially thought, maybe 50, with lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled often, or used to. Fräulein Hoffmann, he said, pronouncing her name carefully. I'm told you speak some English. Yes, sir, Greta replied in English, her accent heavy but comprehensible. I study in school, before the war. He nodded, seeming pleased. Good. We have a problem. We've got over 200 German prisoners here now, most of them women from auxiliary units like yours, and only 3 translators. We need help with everything: medical appointments, work assignments, conflict resolution. The pay isn't much, just credit in the camp store, but it'll give you something to do besides sit and think. Something to do besides sit and think? That, more than the promise of pay, decided her. I help. When you need, I help. Good. Morrison pulled out a form and began filling it in. You'll start this afternoon. First assignment is the medical tent. We've got about 30 women who need follow-up examinations, and Dr. Brennan is struggling to communicate what he needs them to do. He paused, looking up at her. How are you settling in? Is there anything you need? The question surprised her. When had a captor ever asked a prisoner what they needed? We have food, we have beds. It is more than many have now. That's not what I asked. I asked if there's anything you need. Greta didn't know how to answer that. What she needed was her family safe, her country whole, the past 6 years erased. What she needed was impossible. I need to know, she finally said, if there's any way to get news from Germany, from Hamburg, about families. Morrison's expression grew somber. We're working on setting up a letter system through the Red Cross. It'll take time. The mail system in Germany is completely destroyed, but it's being worked on. When it's available, you'll be one of the first to know. It was something. A small something. Barely anything at all, but Greta found herself grateful for even that scrap of possibility. The morning passed in a blur of activity. Women were assigned to work details, some to the camp kitchens, some to laundry, some to maintenance. The Americans were clear that this wasn't punishment labor, but rather a way to keep the camp functioning and give the prisoners a purpose. Greta watched women file off to their assignments, some reluctant, some relieved to have something to occupy their hands. Liesel was assigned to the kitchen, her round face and generally anxious demeanor apparently suggesting to someone that she'd be good with food preparation. She looked terrified, but Margareta, who had also been assigned to kitchen duty, took her under her wing with the same brisk efficiency she probably used with nervous students. Annalise, unsurprisingly, was sent to work in the camp gardens. Finally, something that makes sense, she muttered as she left. Greta spent the early afternoon in the medical tent, trying to explain to frightened women why the American doctor needed to listen to their lungs, look in their mouth, check their pulses. Dr. Brennan was a patient man, elderly and grandfatherly, but his English instructions, filtered through Greta's limited vocabulary and then delivered to women who were already terrified, produced a comedy of errors that would have been funny in any other context.
Tell her I need to check her reflexes, Dr. Brennan said, holding up a small rubber hammer. Greta tried. Der Doktor, will...
She struggled to remember the word for reflexes. Will hit your knee. A little. To see how your body works. The woman, a former radio operator named Christian, stared at Greta in horror. He wants to hit me? No, Greta hastened to explain. Not hit. Test. With a hammer. It is normal. Medical. Christian looked far from convinced, but she allowed Dr. Brennan to tap her knee with the rubber hammer. When her leg jerked in response, she gasped, and the doctor smiled. Perfect, he said. See, reflex is good. By the time the afternoon session ended, Greta's head ached from the constant mental translation, and she'd learned at least 20 medical terms she'd never needed before. But she'd also earned a small amount of credit in the camp store. And more importantly, she'd spent hours not thinking about Hamburg or her mother or whether her younger brother Hans had survived the final days of the war. Dinner that evening brought another round of those strange American drinks. This time, Greta tried the root beer again, wanting to confirm her first impressions. Yes, still sweet, still strange, still that complex flavor she couldn't quite name, but also, she realized, starting to become familiar. The shock of the foreign was wearing off, replaced by something like acceptance. I think I might actually be starting to like this, Liesel admitted, sipping her own root beer. She'd come back from the kitchen exhausted, but less hollow-eyed. Is that allowed? Am I allowed to like something about being here? I don't think there are rules about what we're allowed to feel, Margaret said. She was drinking Coca-Cola tonight, apparently having developed a preference. Though God knows I keep waiting for someone to hand us a rule book. Annalise had hands dirty from the garden work, soil under her nails that she'd scrubbed at but couldn't completely remove. The tomatoes here are huge, red and perfect. I've never seen tomatoes like that, and they're just growing. No one's stealing them. No one's desperate enough to rip them from the vine before they're ripe. They're just growing. There was something in her voice, wonder, yes, but also grief. Grief for a place where tomatoes couldn't just grow, where desperation had made thieves of everyone, where nothing was safe and nothing was sacred. That night, Greta lay in her bed and thought about routines, about how quickly the human mind adapted to new circumstances, how readily it accepted the unthinkable as normal. 3 days ago, she had been on a transport ship, terrified and sick and certain that whatever awaited them in America would be brutal. Now she was drinking root beer and translating medical terms and sleeping in a bed that, while not comfortable, was at least a bed. Was this what victory looked like for the victors? An abundance so casual that they could give prisoners choices between beverages? A wealth so complete that they could afford to feed their enemies real butter and fresh vegetables? She thought about the soldier who had served the drinks that first night. Morrison, she knew now. He had mentioned a daughter in one of their brief conversations that day, a girl about Liesel's age who was in college studying to be a teacher. His voice had gone soft when he spoke of her, proud and loving, and Greta had realized that he looked at the prisoners and saw perhaps his daughter, saw someone's daughter, saw human beings rather than enemies. It was disorienting, this humanity from captors. It would have been easier in some ways if they had been cruel. Cruelty she understood. Cruelty made sense in the logic of war. But this careful feeding, this concern for medical care, this offering of strange, sweet drinks as if their preferences mattered, this undid something in her that she didn't know how to reconstruct. Across the barracks, Hilda was crying again, those same quiet, muffled sobs. But tonight someone went to her. Margaret, moving through the darkness with the confidence of a woman who had comforted crying children for years, sat on the edge of Hilda's bed and spoke in low, gentle tones that Greta couldn't make out. After a while, the crying stopped, and Margaret returned to her own bed. Routines, Greta thought. Connections. Small acts of kindness. Maybe that's what survival looked like. Maybe that's how you rebuilt yourself from nothing,
one routine at a time, one connection at a time, one unexpected taste of sweetness at a time. She closed her eyes and tried to sleep. Outside, the American guards walked their rounds. Inside, 200 women who had lost a war but not yet their lives tried to figure out what came next. The late August heat gradually gave way to the gentler warmth of early September. Greta marked time by small changes: the angle of sunlight through the barracks windows, the slight cooling of evenings, the way certain trees at the camp's edge began to hint at autumn color. 2 weeks had passed since their arrival, and Camp Stark had developed its own rhythm, a rhythm the prisoners had no choice but to learn. Greta's role as translator had expanded. She now spent her mornings in various administrative offices, helping process new arrivals, and her afternoons mediating disputes, translating work instructions, and occasionally sitting in on interrogation sessions, where American intelligence officers tried to extract information about the German military structure. These sessions were always polite, almost apologetic, nothing like the interrogations Greta had imagined. One afternoon, she translated for a woman named Elsa Zimmermann, who had been a high-ranking officer in the Nachtrichten Helferinnen. She was 45, steel-haired and stern, and she answered every question with the minimum information required by the Geneva Convention, and not one word more.
"I'm trying to understand the communication protocols," the American officer said, a captain named Edwards who looked perpetually tired. "Not for intelligence purposes, but to help us process records properly. If you could just name, rank, serial number," Elsa said in heavily accented English, cutting him off. "That is all I am required to give." Edwards sighed. "Ma'am, the war is over. We're not asking you to betray anything. We're just trying to organize paperwork." "Paperwork," Elsa repeated coldly. "How very American. To think that paperwork matters more than—" She stopped herself, lips pressing into a thin line. Greta, translating, found herself in the awkward position of being invisible and essential simultaneously. She could see both sides: Elsa's stubborn dignity, her refusal to cooperate with an enemy even in defeat, and Edward's genuine confusion about why a request for bureaucratic information was being treated as an act of war. "The war is over," Greta found herself saying, not translating, but speaking on her own. "Frau Zimmermann, the war is over. They're not trying to humiliate you. They're just trying to understand what we did so they can figure out what to do with us." Elsa turned her cold gaze on Greta. "And you would have me cooperate, betray our protocols to make their paperwork easier. I would have you recognize reality. We lost. Germany lost. Fighting them over paperwork doesn't change that. It just makes everything harder for everyone." For a long moment, Elsa stared at her. Then, slowly, the older woman's shoulders sagged. "I was so sure. Until the very end, I was sure we would prevail, that our cause was just, that our victory was inevitable." She looked at Captain Edwards. "What you must think of us, what the world must think." Edwards' expression softened. "I think," he said slowly, Greta translating, "that you were loyal to your country. I think a lot of people were loyal to things that turned out to be terrible. That doesn't make the loyalty less real. It just makes it tragic." Elsa answered his questions after that, speaking in a low, defeated voice that was somehow harder to hear than her earlier defiance. In the camp kitchens, Liesel was learning to cook, American style. She'd never been particularly skilled in the kitchen back home. Her mother had always handled the cooking, but Margarite had taken it upon herself to teach the younger woman, and the American cooks were surprisingly patient with their German assistants. "The portions are insane. They throw away more food than we used to eat in a week. Just throw it away,"
When I tried to save the scraps, thinking maybe we could use them for something, Sergeant Morrison told me that was against health regulations. Health regulations about throwing away perfectly good food. She was agitated, gesturing with her hands, but there was also something else in her manner, a kind of energy that had been absent those first few days. Having work to do, having something to learn, seemed to be helping her. I made apple pie today, real apple pie with sugar and cinnamon and a proper crust. The cook, his name is Frank, he's from somewhere called Iowa, showed me how. And then we served it at dinner, and do you know what some of the women did? They cried. They actually cried over pie. I understood. I'd seen similar reactions to the meals. The way that ordinary abundance, taken for granted by the Americans, felt like a miracle to women who had spent years with empty bellies and ersatz everything. Each meal was a reminder of what had been lost, what had perhaps never existed for some of them even before the war. Anneliese had found her own form of adaptation in the gardens. She worked alongside 2 American soldiers who had been farmers before the war, and a shared language of growing things had created a bridge where words couldn't. Greta sometimes saw her during the day, bent over rows of vegetables, her hands in the earth, her face peaceful in a way it never was inside the barracks. "I'm teaching them about companion planting," Anneliese told the small group one evening, a note of pride in her voice. "They plant everything in straight rows, very orderly, very American. But I showed them how marigolds can protect tomatoes, how beans add nitrogen to the soil. They listened, actually listened." "Of course they listened," Margarita said. "Knowledge is knowledge regardless of which side of a war you're on."
But not everyone was adapting. Hilda Schaefer grew thinner despite the adequate food. She attended meals but ate little, pushing food around her plate with the same listless motions. She'd been assigned to laundry duty but performed her tasks mechanically, like a machine running down. Greta tried to engage her in conversation, but Hilda's responses were monosyllabic, her eyes focused on something no one else could see. "I'm worried about her," Marguerite confided to Greta one evening. They were sitting outside the barracks, enjoying the cooling air. Inside, other women played cards or mended clothes or wrote letters they might never be able to send. "She's not fighting, she's just fading." "Should we tell someone?" Greta asked. "The camp doctor?" "And say what? That she's sad? That she's grieving? We're all grieving." Marguerite sighed. "But yes, you're right. She needs help. More help than we can give her." The next morning, Greta mentioned Hilda to Dr. Brennan during one of their translation sessions. The old doctor listened carefully, nodding. "I'll see her this afternoon," he promised. "Depression is as real an illness as pneumonia, even if you can't see it. We'll try to help." The mail system through the Red Cross was finally established in the 3rd week of September. The announcement sent a wave of desperate hope through the camp. Women lined up to fill out forms, to provide names and last known addresses of family members, to write letters that might or might not reach their destinations. Greta wrote to her mother at the old Hamburg address, though she had no idea if the building still stood or if her mother was even alive to receive it. She wrote to her brother Hans, care of his last military unit, though that unit had likely been destroyed or disbanded. She wrote to Clara, her best friend, who had stayed in Hamburg when Greta joined the Auxiliary Corps. She wrote letters into the void and tried not to think about the silence that might be the only response. Liesel wrote to her parents in Stuttgart, her hand shaking so badly that the letters were barely legible. "They're old," she whispered to Greta. "My father has a weak heart. If something happened during the bombings—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Marguerite wrote no letters. When Greta asked her why, she simply shook her head. "There's no one left to write to," she said quietly. "My husband is dead. My sons are dead. My parents were killed in an air raid in '43. Everyone is gone."
Surely there's someone, a cousin, a friend? Even if there were, Marguerite said, her voice steady despite the pain in her eyes. What would I say? Hello, I'm alive and you're alive, and isn't that wonderful even though everyone we loved is dead and our country is destroyed? She shook her head again. No, some silences are better than words. The beverages at meals had become routine. Greta found herself developing a preference for root beer, enjoying its complex sweetness over the sharper bite of Coca-Cola. She noticed that women tended to split into camps, the root beer drinkers and the Coca-Cola drinkers, and that this silly preference somehow mattered, became a small marker of identity in a place where identity was otherwise stripped away. I don't understand how anyone can drink that cola stuff, Annalise said one evening, wrinkling her nose at Marguerite's bottle. It tastes like medicine. This coming from someone who drinks what tastes like liquid candy, Marguerite retorted, but she was smiling. These small debates, these meaningless preferences were oddly comforting. They were normal, human, a reminder that they were still capable of opinions about trivial things. One afternoon, a new group of prisoners arrived, not German, but Italian, women who had served in Mussolini's auxiliary forces and had been captured in northern Italy. They were processed separately but housed in adjacent barracks, and their presence changed the camp's dynamic. Now there were multiple languages, multiple experiences, multiple national identities trying to coexist in the same space. Greta was pressed into service, translating not just German to English, but trying to help facilitate communication between the German and Italian prisoners. Her Italian was poor, just a few phrases she had picked up from an Italian family that had lived in Hamburg's neighborhood before the war. "We should stick together," one of the Italian women said, a fierce-eyed woman named Lucia who had been a radio operator in Milan. "We're all prisoners. We should support each other." But not all the German women agreed. Old prejudices, old hierarchies, old resentments about how Italy had surrendered earlier, about how they'd been weak allies, these things didn't disappear just because the war was over. Greta found herself in the middle of arguments she didn't want to mediate, defending women who had been called traitors by other women who didn't see the irony in calling anyone a traitor when they were all prisoners of the same victors. "This is what happens," Sergeant Morrison said to her one afternoon when she'd come to his office frustrated after a particularly ugly dispute. "War creates divisions, and those divisions don't heal overnight. Sometimes they don't heal at all." "Then what's the point?" Greta asked, her English improving with practice. "What's the point of any of this if we just keep hating each other?" "The point is," Sergeant Morrison said, "that you get up and try again tomorrow. You keep trying to build bridges even when people keep burning them down. Because the alternative is giving up, and giving up is how the hatred wins permanently." He offered her a root beer from a small cooler he kept in his office. Somehow, he had figured out her preference. Greta took it, the bottle cold and familiar in her hand. She'd had maybe 30 or 40 of these bottles now, and they no longer tasted strange, they just tasted like something, a marker of time, a small constant in a world of change.
"Why are you kind to us?" she asked suddenly. "You don't have to be. We're prisoners. We're Germans. The enemy. Why do you bother being kind?" Morrison was quiet for a moment, looking at his own bottle of Coca-Cola. "My daughter," he finally said. "Sarah. She's 22, studying to be a teacher. When this war started, she wanted to enlist, to do her part. I was terrified. Terrified that she'd end up captured, or worse. And I kept thinking, if she was captured, if she was in a camp somewhere in Germany, or Italy, or Japan, I hoped that someone would be kind to her, that someone would see her as a person, not just an enemy. So I try to be that person for someone else's daughter." Greta felt tears burning behind her eyes. "My mother," she whispered. "If she's alive, she'll be wondering if I'm being treated well, if I'm suffering." "Write to her," Morrison said. "Tell her you're being treated well. Tell her about the apple pie, and the root beer, and the garden. Tell her you're alive and thinking of her. Maybe the letter will reach her. Maybe it won't. But at least you'll have tried." That evening, Greta wrote another letter to her mother. This one was different from the first. Less desperate, more detailed. She described Camp Stark, the barracks, the work assignments. She described root beer, trying to put into words a taste her mother had never experienced. She described Liesel and Marguerite and Anneliese, the friendships that were forming in this strange place. She described being useful as a translator, having a purpose. She didn't describe the fear that woke her every night, the dreams of Hamburg burning, the guilt that sat like a stone in her chest. Some things couldn't be written, even to a mother. The end of September brought the first real cold snap. Women who had arrived in late summer uniforms now needed warmer clothing, and the Americans issued them used civilian clothing, donations, they were told, from American churches and community groups. Greta received a wool sweater that was slightly large and a pair of sturdy shoes that actually fit. The shoes were remarkable, not beautiful, but functional and whole, with no holes or cardboard inserts. She'd worn the same boots for 3 years, patching them repeatedly, feeling every stone through their worn soles. These American donation shoes felt like luxury. "It's strange," Liesel said, pulling on a donated coat. "Wearing clothes from people who probably hate us. Eating food provided by people whose sons we helped kill." "Maybe they don't hate us," Marguerite suggested. "Maybe they just see what we are. Defeated, displaced, hungry. Maybe they can separate the humanity from the politics." "Can they?" Anneliese asked quietly. "Can we?" It was a question none of them could answer. The question hung in the cool October air as they walked back to the barracks after dinner, their donated coats wrapped tight against the chill. Winter came early that year. By November, snow blanketed Camp Stark, transforming it into something almost beautiful. The barracks were heated, if not luxuriously, and the women learned to navigate ice-slicked paths between buildings. With winter came the first responses to their letters. Greta's arrived on a gray morning in late November. Sergeant Morrison brought it to her himself, his expression unreadable. Her hands shook as she opened the envelope, seeing her mother's familiar handwriting, shaky now, aged, but unmistakably hers.
My darling Greta, you are alive. Thank God you are alive. Hamburg is rubble, but we survive. Your brother Hans was found by the British alive, injured but healing. He is in a hospital in their zone. We have little, but we have each other. And now we know we have you. Do not feel guilty for being fed. Do not apologize for surviving. This is what I prayed for every night, that my children would live to see peace, whatever that peace looked like. Your strange American root beer sounds sweet. I hope someday to taste it with you. Greta read the letter 3 times, then pressed it to her chest and wept. Liesel, who had also received a letter that morning, wept with her. Marguerite, who had received nothing and never would, held them both and found her own complicated peace in their joy. That evening at dinner, Greta chose root beer, as always. The taste was completely familiar now, no longer foreign, no longer shocking. Just sweet, just cold, just a small thing that marked the passage of time, from war to whatever came after war. She thought about her mother's words, "Do not feel guilty for surviving." Around her, women ate and drank and talked. Some had received letters, some hadn't, some never would. But they were all here, all alive, all learning to carry the weight of their past while stepping, uncertainly, into an unknowable future. Greta raised her bottle of root beer, caught Liesel's eye, and saw the younger woman raise her own bottle in return. Not a toast, that would have been too celebratory, too inappropriate. Just an acknowledgement. We are here. We survived. Tomorrow we try again. Outside, the first winter stars appeared in the darkening sky. Inside, in a prison camp in America, women who had lost everything learned that sometimes survival itself was enough. Sometimes a letter from home, a warm meal, and a bottle of sweetness were enough to build a tomorrow on. The war was over. The living remained. And in that remaining, there was something that might eventually become hope.